Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you can hear me. I had a minor coffee accident, so I am customarily late. And we're going to start by apologizing. No, my brain is dead. We're going to start by acknowledging the people who have left questions right at the beginning, and we'll sort of scoot through those very quickly. Hello, 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 beautiful community. You can hear me. You can hear me. Hello, Bobby. Hi, hi, hi. Hi, everybody. Everybody can hear me. No problems. Let's jump straight into questions. I'm going to try to take these a bit atypically. I'm going to try to take them a bit quickfire because I think some of our questions are going to be repetitive tonight. They're going to be, what is going on? There is a video on the main channel. It came out about 2 hours ago. So check it out if you haven't seen it yet. I tried to say a few things in a condensed way in that video, but there's quite a few things I also left out. I don't always like my interviews, but I liked my interview this morning on BBC Radio Wales because it covered a lot in something like 8 minutes. So check that out too. It's accessible globally. Let's go with the questions. AKH, who would be Putin's preferred successor? Putin has a lack of capacity to implement a successor plan. He is not powerful enough to install his own successor. The last time Putin was powerful enough to stably install his own successor was over 5 years ago, in my opinion. Trash0815. Vlad, am I seeing it right that in your philosophy you see any politicization as a positive? No, absolutely not. There is such a thing as a fascist politicization, right? If all of us here, let's say there's 800 of us here at the moment, if all of us are politically apathetic, and then our introduction into politics is to join a fascist organization, Ivan from Israel, how you going? Is to join a fascist organization. Of course, that's a dreadful form of politicization. But sometimes in a depoliticized society, the solution is going to come via politicization. Doesn't mean it's going to be good, but it means that you can't bypass it. So that depoliticized blob in the middle, for example, in Russia, is going to have to wake up at some point. QWERTY, how could Prigozhin have thought there was a better outcome? What was his end game? So this is the bit that sort of got left out. And here I'm actually very empathetic with a lot of academics and scholars who are pissed off at how loosely people have been talking about a coup and a revolution, and how people have been cheering on Prigozhin. And these experts are indeed right that the majority of people with large social media followings who are cheering on Prigozhin have no idea how the Putin regime works, have no idea who Prigozhin is. And that is inevitable because if you've got into East European politics in the last year, you're just not going to understand. You're not going to understand Russian politics in a year. That is the predicament of most big accounts speaking about this. So I can understand experts being pissed off about it. But here's the paradox that we're looking at. I mean, if you take ethics out of the window, there is something quite mellifluous about Prigozhin, of the kind that Werner Herzog would really appreciate, the great German filmmaker. Because here is a man trying to make his luck by taking an extraordinarily ambitious and theatrical political action that is inevitably going to destabilize power and create potentially revolutionary situation. But the man is creating a revolutionary situation without wanting to take power. That's a paradox of Prigozhin. But the reason I've put this word coup into the title of my main channel video is quite simply that on YouTube you have to put the vegetables inside, but you have to put a little bit of candy on the outside. And you shouldn't get lost about that, but it's a reasonable practice. But I can see how people have a problem with the word coup, and I do too. I suppose, though, that Prigozhin created a coup-like situation without necessarily intending to take power. So that's a kind of an extraordinarily romantic political act, the revolutionary who doesn't want power. There is a kind of a real antithesis here to Putin in Prigozhin's extraordinarily pure criminality. Putin's criminality is impure, it's pathetic, it's lame, it's full of various kinds of dark corners and paradoxes. But there's a kind of a purity to Prigozhin's banditry. So that's what I'm going to say for now. The day before yesterday, you mentioned how this was to be a quote-unquote coup. This is Emiya. You said it's going to be a coup against the MOD and not Putin himself. Was it indeed? If so, why was Big Putin so afraid and triggered? Well, Putin is triggered by any kind of existential political betrayal, of course, is his worst nightmare. He invaded Ukraine partly because he is terrified of what role Ukraine might play once the revolutionary situation arises in Russia, if Ukraine is by that time an independent and democratic country. It could act as a kind of platform to topple Putin in a situation in which he might not otherwise get toppled. So this was aimed at the MOD, but it was, to put this in cartoonish terms, a case of Prigozhin saying, I need more slices of this cake I'm entitled to. And it's secondary than whether you guys stay in office or not. Give me more of the cake I need. But his ask for the cake generated a near revolutionary situation. So that's this extraordinarily capital R romantic political situation that Prigozhin brought about. He is the revolutionary who has no interest in taking power. I left that out of the analysis on the main channel video. It probably should have been in it. The main channel, I simply said that to go further, to succeed more, Prigozhin needed more folks to siphon off to him, perhaps from the military, and for that to trigger a few folks in the elite to hang in there a bit longer and watch what's going to happen. On the positive side, that he needed more of that. On the negative side, he probably got, he plausibly or possibly got information that it would not be physically possible for him to advance beyond a certain point if he wants to if he wants to have that allegedly 5,000 strong gang that was heading for Moscow, headed by the number 2 in Wagner, Utkin. We'll carry on. Just race through these questions. People in Rostov, Edwin is saying, seem to embrace Wagner. Don't get too carried away by that. It's plausible that most people might be on the side of the MOD if Wagner and MOD clash. But of course, they're going to be on the side of Wagner too in some numbers. But this shouldn't be exaggerated and sort of overly romanticized. So when Wagner come in, it's going to be more apathy than a sense of being, you know, met with anything that's a liberatory force. We're going to see more, Tevi B, about what it means for Prigozhin to have been let off the hook. We're going to see more about what happens. I do think it's significant in this calculation that Prigozhin wasn't trying to take Putin's power, but he created a situation in which a byproduct of his actions could have been a step in that direction, which is why it's a revolutionary situation. He created a revolutionary situation or a near revolutionary situation, whatever his intent was. Mr. Big Disco Party. What do you think was the deal made by Prigozhin to stand down? We're going to find out more about it. We don't know enough because we're getting information from systematic information manipulators. So we're going to get a sense of what Prigozhin's fate is going to be, how and whether he's going to be banished and where. We're going to find out what's going to happen with Wagner in different parts of the world too. Sarah, what does Prigozhin being allowed to walk away mean to oligarchs that may want to challenge Putin and the rank and file Russians who are punished far more seriously for far less? It's difficult because there aren't oligarchs in Russia. I mean, oligarchs are people who have political power because they have a lot of money. You don't have any political power in Russia just because you have a lot of money. Quite the opposite. Your money just potentially belongs to the state, give or take a couple of wrong turns. I would just go back to this point we made about how Prigozhin was functional to the Putin regime. It was functional for the Putin regime that Prigozhin was attacking the MOD. And then it ceased to be functional because Prigozhin got out of hand. In terms of the rank and file Russians who are punished for far less, well, the folks who are depoliticized, they're going to some extent look away from this too. And the folks who are oppositional, well, they know everything. And they probably understand the dynamics of Prigozhin's usefulness to the regime too. Let us see where we are. Could Prigozhin have survived in Russia once Wagner was removed from his control? I don't know how to answer that question. You can survive in Russia quite easily if the regime isn't after you. So that simply would have been a byproduct of what arrangements were made and what offers were put on the table for Mr. Prigozhin. Suvara, would asking a Russian audience, would you what you wish had happened be more politicizing than asking why it happened? So Prigozhin created a near revolutionary situation, even though he wasn't trying to displace Putin. I mean, he wasn't even trying to displace Shoigu and Gerasimov. He was trying to give them a good kicking or knock them off without replacing them. But when you have that kind of situation that has these big elements of civil war, then it's a binary choice. You're either wanting whatever Prigozhin was doing to go further, or you want him to be stopped. So I think that binary was to some extent politicizing, but that's not to say that most people got politicized by it. Not at all. People were watching what was happening. It was spectatorial. But Nick Bear, good evening. But it's politicizing, because even though you're presented with two evils, Prigozhin and the Putin regime, you got to choose. And interestingly, one opposition leader, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, jumped in with Prigozhin and said we should support Prigozhin. That position can't really be judged on the spot, because it's a question of saying, okay, well, let's look at where the Russian opposition are on this. Some of them have said, no, we don't want anything to do with Prigozhin. Others have said, well, we'd like Prigozhin to do well in his march on Moscow. We'd like him to progress further and create more havoc. And then what you do then is judge these people after the event, right, on the basis of their ethical luck. Right? So if Mr. Putin had backed Mr. Prigozhin and Mr. Prigozhin got a bit further and then created some kind of a bloodbath and didn't achieve anything, well, that would have been on Mr. Khodorkovsky. Now, the problem with Khodorkovsky's position is that Prigozhin so transparently, looking at this in retrospect now, didn't want to take power, that what are you backing exactly when you're backing him? You're backing a kind of wrecking ball force. I suppose you can still make that argument. I suppose the argument Mr. Khodorkovsky would make here is Mr. Prigozhin is sabotaging Russia's war. If you think sabotaging Russia's war is good, then you go with Prigozhin. If you think that trying to protect the endeavor of Russia's war, then you don't. But I think either way, you should judge these people on the basis of outcomes of their politicizing interventions. Sagliknok. Could this thing in future feed our souls to never want war again, to bring such rejoice this thing? Look, I believe that the difference between us and tigers isn't that tigers are predators and we are not. It's that we are both predators, but unlike tigers, our predations are enormously mediated by culture. But that doesn't mean that we aren't predators. Right? Much the same can be said about various other destructive impulses. And the problem we've got is that while it's not always the case, relations between countries are the least formal human relations there are. They're the least rule-based, the least regulated human relations there are. Large-scale evil will always erupt in relations between countries. There is an inevitability about that. The only way to get round it is to make an argument that pursuing a world government is a coherent enterprise. And that already is a tough ask. It's not just that it's unrealistic to the point of impossibility, it's also not even clear that it's a coherent aspiration to aim for. So, but that doesn't mean we can't always make things better. Crimson Striker, even if he didn't get the elite, isn't it at least concerning for them that so many rank and file soldiers didn't resist Wagner's advance? I mean, it was a kind of a metaphor on Russia's sort of borderlessness. We've had these minor metaphors on it with these Ukrainian-controlled groups that have gone into Russian territory, the Russian, Ukrainian-controlled Russian groups that have gone into Russian territory without sufficient resistance. So it's Russia's borderlessness. It's the fact that Russian military is so tied up in the war. And then, of course, there was resistance to the Wagnerite advance, and that resistance would have taken a different order if they got to Moscow. I mean, if they got to Moscow and genuinely continued to behave in a revolutionary way, they would have been eliminated, even at the cost of many, many civilian casualties. Good to see you, Raz. Raz, to me, I don't feel any transparency at all to whatever arrangement was made with Mr. Prigozhin. I don't know what the details are. I don't think Mr. Prigozhin's position is particularly strong at all. I think his position is precarious. And it's neither transparent to me what the details are, nor do I have any faith that they'll necessarily be stuck to. In other words, it's reasonable for Mr. Prigozhin, beyond any deals, I think, to worry about his safety. So we're going to see what happens. Very grateful to you, but I'm sorry that that's simply an I don't know. I hope you understand. Sleeping Beauty, that's very kind of you to try to share my interview. I don't know what the rules are with links in these chat forums. Peterski, dear Vlad, it's always a pleasure to listen to your rational, calming explanations. All the best to you. Aussie T, hi. Unti is asking, who's my favorite opposition figure in Russia? Well, in the sense of the kind of sympathy you can have for somebody you'd vote for, I couldn't have any, even if there was somebody amazing. I wouldn't feel that kind of emotion, because I'd feel that emotion for probably a Western politician, in particular a British politician, because that would not be in any way my politician, a Russian politician. Now, having said that, I did feel very fond about the unbuttoned immediacy of Boris Nemtsov. There was something, in a positive sense, distinctively Russian about him. A kind of almost seraphic simplicity of sentiment, including political sentiment. Now, a different sense of that question, who do I think is effective? I'm very critical of the effectiveness of most of the figures who are in the public eye, I'm afraid. So if I went through a list and scored them, it would not be today an enormously flattering set of scorecards, but this can change. What I would say is that Mr. Navalny is probably the most political of them all, which is to say, he acts and thinks in the most political way of all of them. Because a lot of the Russian opposition folks, they are cold politicians, but I don't see what there is that's political about them. They are engaged moralists, they are broadcasters, they are investigators, they are opinion journalists, they are investigative journalists in the case of folks in the Navalny team. So that there are a whole bunch of marvelous things, but these things are not political. So my problem with, I suppose, trying to line things up in answer to that question is that I don't think the majority of the Russian opposition are politicians at all. I think they are broadcasters, journalists of various kinds, activists. So it would be good if there were more politicians. And it was a political act, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's wise or not, of Mr. Khodorkovsky to come out and say, I am with Prigozhin. Not he supported Prigozhin, but that here you should back Prigozhin against Putin. That was his position. And that's an explicitly political act. Didn't really have much friction in reality, but it was a political act. Tethris, what's the likelihood of a general uprising in Belarus succeeding if Ukraine were to encourage it with the Belarusian volunteers going into Belarus? I would say it's low, so long as the Kremlin exercises good enough control over itself and over Belarus. Belarus is partly captured now, and unfortunately, that could mean that Belarusian liberation is impossible without Russian liberation. And Russian liberation ain't looking like a pretty prospect. CS79N, good to see you. What impact will this have on Belarus? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where Mr. Prigozhin is going. I don't know about the details. I don't know about the veracity of the details, even if I knew more of the details. So for me, I don't have a clear picture what happens with Prigozhin next. I suspect it's possible that he might not even. I wouldn't be surprised if Putin didn't. So we're going to see. You're asking whether Lukashenko is emboldened. Here's what I would say. Lukashenko is a political actor who would be interested in survival even if there were no Belarus as an independent state. So Lukashenko is not somebody who is a Belarusian tyrant and that's it. He's a political actor. If the only pool he has is some kind of Russian pool, with Russia having swallowed up Belarus at some point, for example, Lukashenko will be happy to swim about and be person number 7 in Russia. This is very hypothetical, but it's just to reflect his psychology. And then I'm not going to say much about Azerbaijan or Armenia, except to say that Russian soft power and Russian hard power is enormously diminished to intervene and guarantee anything, whether it's dreadful things or not dreadful things. So my attitude is don't expect anything and don't rely on Russia to solve any problems in its former spheres of influence. The best thing is to, as Dugin says, the best thing if you're near Russia is to stay as far away as you can. What's the best way to throw Russia out of Ukraine so they win big? Is it just a question of brute force and weapons or something else? I do think that Ukraine would have been in a slightly different situation had it got more weapons earlier, because it could have used them at a different time when the Russians were less prepared. Of course, you could talk about giving Ukraine weapons it hasn't been given. And the more of those you give, the more progress Ukraine would make. I don't think, short of some kind of special Russian military collapse, or as I was saying on the main channel a couple of hours ago, a morale-mediated Russian military collapse, short of that, there's no real way to guarantee Russia being emphatically evicted short of Western intervention. Western intervention in Ukraine is direct Western intervention in Ukraine is something that would only be considered, I imagine, if Russia started a nuclear war. So, but in that video on the main channel about Ukraine's counteroffensive, I give a few tips which don't fully, I think, end up in the unconditional commitment to Ukrainian victory position, because for me that is a normatively compelling position, but it's too far from where Western states as a whole are at to go with it. So it's about 3 or 4 different things. It's about reflecting on security guarantees for Ukraine. It's about reflecting on how we're going to militarily support Ukraine for future counteroffensives, whatever happens with this one. It's about an ongoing commitment to keep backing Ukraine as it continues to fight for the reacquisition of its territory. Blah, 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 blah. So we could take more steps in that direction, but short of the West getting directly involved, there's no way to just kick Russia out readily and quickly. Royal Dingus, do we have the wobble now that you talked about? Wobble number 1, what effect does the relative silence of the regime and its propaganda have on this situation? Well, Putin wasn't silent, but he was silent for a while, and he was utterly pathetic when he spoke. And I rather mock him in the last video I made on the main channel. I thought his speech was pathetic, and it's clear to me that it wasn't written in part even by anybody else. My toddler version of Putin's speech is, save the Russian state, save me, save me, save me, save me. Don't let danger befall me. A correct tyrant speech is, some hopeless people are marching around. They'll march for a bit, then they'll stop marching. So I'm just here to let you know that everything is going to be under control, even if it isn't right now. And everything will go as planned. And we're facing a few challenges here, but I'll be back with an update about what we're doing to solve them, and solve them we will. That's the tyrant speech. The non-tyrant speech is 1917 revolution. The revolution. I'm scared of revolutions. Oh, and then traitors. Oh, and betrayal, and everybody has betrayed me, and the West are so bad that they've betrayed me, and they're so bad. Oh, they are really bad. And once I was eating in the West, and somebody didn't serve me my food in the right way, and I can't forget about it. I'm really traumatized by that. Save me, save me, save me. That was Putin's speech. Underneath that, there was rage at Prigozhin. Absolutely pathetic. absolutely pathetic. You would think that you could transcend that despite all of the corruption of the office, but no, that's what you got. It's just such an extraordinary illustration of a banal truth. A lot of things that are true aren't banal, but this is a banal truth of how unconstrained power degenerates the human personality. And I'm not taking the piss out of Putin because he's evil or because he has attacked Ukraine. Um, you could be the worst genocidal maniac in human history, but not cry like a baby. But he cried like a baby. Rune, I don't see Prigozhin as having presidential ambitions. He's the sort of person who would take them up if they fell into his lap. But um, that would be a case of a byproduct of, you know, I mean, if Putin somehow miraculously managed to lose power with this Prigozhin march on Moscow, and Prigozhin took power, which is really a stretch beyond the stretch, it would really be like the guy who went out for a piece of pie and came home with a sheep. Eh, you know, he's got a sheep now, but he just wanted an apple pie. He wanted more of the apple pie than he felt he was getting. So it would be a sort of byproduct of this extraordinary um, romantic political self propulsion that is about making one's luck. And I talked about that concept in a slightly more sophisticated way on the philosophy channel because it's a Machiavellian concept. What Machiavelli believed was that the very greatest politicians can somehow exercise a degree of control over situations that seem uncontrollable. And he didn't want to be silly about that, but he talked about what in reality it means to make one's own luck politically. And one of the features that distinguish great leaders from good leaders, and this is not an ethical endorsement, Machiavelli would be neutral about, you know, how many, people you threw in the lake. But there was such a thing as having a knack for getting lucky. That means that the luck isn't just luck, but also is somehow an expression of agency. And on a large scale, what Prigozhin did was an action of that kind because he was flying a bit blind because you never know exactly how brittle that thing is that you push yourself into. Um, and Michael Kaufman, wonderful military expert, was saying, I think today, that there was a part of him that felt that maybe Prigozhin knew something about the fragility of the system that isn't, quite reachable for everybody else. Maybe he sensed something and he knew he could push further than we would imagine he could push. So this extraordinary case of making one's own luck by walking into an uncertain situation, a situation where you are pushing something without a real sense of how far you can get away with it. And you just go and see what happens. Putin is making Shoigu the fall guy. Michael is asking a good question. Why hasn't Putin made him the fall guy completely yet? Or is he waiting for things to get worse before he gets rid of him? So this is what I forgot to put into my main video, the video on the main channel. Even if Prigo disappears, or evaporates. What we have to watch out for is the program of Prigozhin's coup being implemented nevertheless without Prigozhin. So we have to watch out for that. We have to watch out for the possibility that there may have been a couple of people who united against Prigozhin, but on the condition that some of the things Prigozhin was pushing for were going to be done, not for Prigozhin, but because there was good reason to do them anyway. So we have to watch that. And again, we're only going to know how this goes by observing what happens over the next few days and weeks. But if we take out that important word of yours, Michael, completely, why isn't he made Shoigu a fall guy completely? Then we can say he has made him a fall guy, and Shoigu has absorbed a lot, very effectively actually, of the stuff that would have been otherwise flying right at Putin himself. And one of the marvels of Prigozhin for Putin was that Prigozhin was redirecting the flak for the, absurdities and calamities of Russia's war effort from Putin to Prigozhin. But we're going to have to watch that space. Falve is saying, yeah, that's a good thought. That was a good thought from Michael. What does Prigozhin know about the system that we don't? And I take this very much as about politicizing the Russian space, because if it's shown, and this has shown, that various things can be pushed quite a bit, this does have a politicizing effect, because it just inevitably makes it less difficult to raise the question, what about an alternative? What about the non-Putin alternative, right? This is what I've been raving on about. This is really the only point. I'm not an expert at anything to do with how the Russian military is situated. I'm not an expert on Wagner at all. I'm not in any way qualified to discuss military matters. But this business of the politicization of the Russian space, there's been a small but nevertheless a qualitative click forward in that regard, that I have been repeating like a broken record, because I believe that's probably the single most obvious political takeaway from what we've seen. You know what's interesting? There are fewer functions in this thing for me to keep up with your comments than there are on the main channel. So maybe it's something to do with being over 100,000. It allows you to track the comments a little bit better. Interesting. Saglik. If chaos evolves, could Georgia, within a relatively short period of time, entertain the idea of pushing for their annexed territories? Georgia is in a uncomfortable orbit at the moment. I'm not impressed with that orbit. It's a difficult orbit. So Georgia is quite a bit caught up with Russia at the moment. Even though, and we shouldn't universalize this, there's all kinds of different people in Georgia, but certainly in the big urban centers, there's people who don't want anything to do with Russia, but nevertheless, that's not the kind of government they've got. Lanedo, I don't know how to disaggregate the letters. I'm so sorry. Thank you for your hard work and time. Take care. Thank you for your attention and engagement. Interesting distinction available in the English language between listening and hearing. It's available in other languages too, but there are some languages in which it's not available. And I'm always greatly appreciative of everybody who listens, but I'm also appreciative of people who hear. Caroline, thank you so much. We're 3,000. We're 3,000 because people are wondering what the march was all about. Christopher. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. Rune, stick. It's the answer to your question. Lucinda. Thanks for answering my earlier question. And this whole chat has been really fascinating. Pleasure to have you. What are the possible factions to seize upon Putin's weakness? We're not seeing many factions. The Russian political system is not talking to itself. And that will happen before the Russian political system will begin talking to itself, before the opposition does anything or has a chance to do anything. The way this will progress is when different factions in the regime begin having actual political conflictive conversations, and then things will begin to move. Sarah, thank you for replacing the poor coffee who died before the live stream. Michael, how does he have a job still? Shoigu, we've taken that question already. Robert, Putin is the leader of an Iron Age war band who has come to dominate a polity by force, and because of this, his greatest threat is the devolution of politics, which we see in this Prigozhin action. Thoughts? Well, Putin. There's a video on the main channel about Putin's evolution, which not in any depth, but it touches on Putin in the different terms. And I do think that we have had continuity, but also difference, because that missionary turn that Putin had around 2012, 2014, where he began to have a quasi mystical vision of the mission of Russian culture, with absolutely absurd ideas of what Russian culture might be as well, and then with himself at the center of that historical process. That wasn't the case earlier. That just wasn't the case when Putin made the famous speech in Munich, for example. So we've had different Putins. We had a much more pragmatic Putin in the first two terms. In the first term, Putin was clearly a great deal more reactionary than Yeltsin, and he was uncomfortable to carry on Yeltsin's line, and he did so for a bit reluctantly. So is that an interesting evolution? Um, but what I would say is that both about Putin's conduct and about the kind of state he has built or that has just evolved around him, that there's a great deal of fluid, unprocedural criminality to it. So I'm not sure how that squares with what you imagine to mean by taking a polity, dominating it by force. And again, historically, Putin has not been somebody who wanted to run a very vertical system. He wanted to be a kind of referee, arbitrating between different elites and keeping his own position stable that way. I think it's a great question. I think it's quite a bit to say. So I'm sure we'll end up saying more. Love from Australia, love back. Good to see you again. Is it morally wrong to be disappointed that the entire march on Moscow fizzled out? No, because it could be, you know, um, it was quite a spectacle. And so it was natural to expect that something more would come of it than did. So no, and I think that it's a combination of this character, Prigozhin, being, responsible for all kinds of ghastly human acts on a mass scale. But there's also, at the same time, this kind of criminal purity to him and this kind of romance to what he tried to pull off. Now, I suppose if your question goes to the core of a conversation about effective politics, then I do think experts would debate whether it would be better for Ukraine or better for the world if Prigozhin went even further. Some experts have come out and said that it would be worse if he did. I'm not persuaded by that, I must say. And Rachel, I think you're saying I missed a super thanks from you or a comment from you. I think the Munich beer putsch story is different because I don't think Prigozhin is a guy who is looking for a conventional or unconventional political career. You could imagine Prigozhin sort of wandering into that kind of position like that under other circumstances, but that would be him wandering into that position, going out for an apple pie and bringing home a sheep. Yeah, eventually, I'm going to use some better software that just allows me to negotiate this more successfully. Um, Hontas is saying this deal removes any notion of Russian law. No, there's not a freezing. I'm just deliriously tired, so I'll just go still. I'm trying to scroll up and catch missed questions. It's just not letting me at the moment. Scroll beyond a certain point, so I apologize. I don't do streams on the main channel typically, but the last one The last one I did on there, and I enjoyed this slightly better setup for categorizing chats. What kind of info is being seen by the average politically inactive Russian? Would Putin be worried about their reaction? At the moment, no, he wouldn't be worried about their reaction. Putin's biggest worry with the Russian people is A, not so importantly, why aren't they a little bit more enthusiastic about the war? I don't want them to be too enthusiastic, but why aren't they a bit more enthusiastic? His second reaction is, ooh, if it looks like I'm going to need to fascistize these folks in a few years, even if that's the sort of thing that could be done top down, how am I going to do it? Could I pull that off? And then third, what if he is forced to fascistize them when he thinks there's absolutely no chance to fascistize them, because he is forced to be in some kind of accommodation with various pressures from Z radical circles? Shipmaster, thank you. Shipmaster, thank you. Vitruvian man. Do you think that the uprising being welcomed in Rostov, because they're closer to the front line and more aware of the horrors happening in Ukraine? I think there are lots of Russian towns in which if you rolled in the Australian army, people would just say, excuse me, are these guys in charge now? Australians have taken over? Cool. Okay. Can I go to work? Everything is the same. Okay, fine. Yeah. So that's going to be the response. So we shouldn't be getting carried away with a few pictures that looked so cinematic. And I inserted a couple into my last video in the main channel about Prigozhin being embraced and the Wagner folks being embraced. Certainly people in Rostov weren't terribly scared of them. And I if I were teleported onto the street in Rostov, I wouldn't necessarily be terribly scared of them either. But you never know. Interestingly, right at the beginning of the war, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and now it would be so much less likely, but right at the beginning of the war, there were these exchanges between Russian soldiers and Ukrainian civilians, which entailed a sense of safety and familiarity that it could not be reproduced just even a few months later. It was, it was called conversations like, guys, got enough fuel to travel further? Invading, are you? Invading? Yeah. So, that would not be possible even a few months into the war, but there were these kinds of very familiar exchanges. Do these events have any effect on Russian soft power? They're not good for Russian soft power, but a lot of countries have their national interests, and if it's right for them to trade with Russia, it's right for them to trade with Russia. They have political interests. China has significant political interests. It wants Russia to be positioned vis-a-vis itself and the West in a way that's advantageous to China and disadvantageous to the West. So, yeah. But these things are globally embarrassing, and they show the degree to which the Russian state is a little bit fake. Michael from Kiwiland is asking, what are the chances that the change in the military command will have a significant impact on the front lines? Not my area, but I'd be skeptical. I'd be skeptical that there could be a fundamental change in the war through the Russians replacing people running their war effort with other people. And at the moment, it's clear that the limitations they're facing are not movable. Many of the significant limitations the Russian army are facing are not movable. One thing that is movable is that they still have access to quite a few people they can mobilize, but they're conservative about doing that. But am I going to comment specifically on the military incompetence of Shoigu Gerasimov? I can't evaluate that in all truthfulness, and that would be unethical for me. Johnny, on the gut level, do you think Prigozhin taking power would have led to a quicker end to the war in Ukraine? On a gut level, yes. This is not Mr. Prigozhin's war. He has no interest in this war ideologically. He has no missionary commitment to it. He's at work. He's at work, and he could be at work doing something completely different. Probably involve people getting killed, but it's not really plausible to say that there's an ideological commitment there from Prigozhin. He's not at all like, Mr. Girkin with his quaint, indeed sincere neo-imperialist fantasies. David. Well, they can't be bought by the Wagner can't be bought by the CIA because effectively Wagner is a bit of a part that the Wagner's been fighting in Ukraine is a part of the Russian army with a few differences, with a bit more autonomy, but not that much independence. So no, you can't buy a bit of the Russian army. What would happen if Putin died tomorrow in your eyes? And what is the likelihood of Ukraine, with the current status quo, succeeding in reclaiming all of its territory? If Putin died, the people coming to power would be under enormous pressure to try to begin bringing the war to a close, whoever they were, including Mr. Patrushev even, let alone Mr. Patrushev Jr. So Putin's death would deliver a qualitative blow to the current way in which Russia is pursuing its last imperialistic enterprise. What's the likelihood of Ukraine with the current status quo succeeding? I think that what we saw from Mr. Prigozhin makes Ukraine's success more likely because it makes it easier to imagine. Makes it easier to imagine that the Russian army could experience some kind of catastrophic collapse. But if we allow that, I cannot make any military analysis. Do I personally sit here and feel that Ukraine is on track to retake back all its territories? No, I don't. I don't think that's the likely scenario. But I think it's a possible scenario, absolutely possible. And it's one I would endorse. But of the several possibilities before us, that is not possibility number one from where we sit now. But Dutchy Smoke, love back to you. But that is partly also up to us. Alan is asking, does Dugin have any significant influence on moving events? Well, Dugin has managed to blame Prigozhin's invasion on the West. He has said that, um, or he said something really marvelous. I can tell you exactly what he said, in fact, because I translated it. So let's see. Kimon. It's worth it, yeah. The satanic West and its demonic henchmen have sown these troubles within us. And you can see, as a philosopher of genius, I mean, that's a very profound geopolitical analysis. Mark, thank you. Victor, with the individuals in the Wagner group, will they be more politicized as a result of this march? I think that the predominant attitude in Wagner would be, we've been ordered to do this. It's up to the big guys to work out how far this goes and what this means. We're just going to do this, okay? So that would have been, I think, the preponderant attitude in Wagner. Greetings back to you in Sweden. I haven't been to Sweden since 2001. So that's what I would say. And therefore, you could imagine a lot of the Wagner folks being amenable to, going in the opposite direction if that's what they're told. So I'm skeptical about any kind of politicization there on a large scale, but some, sure. James, was there a risk that Putin would use nuclear weapons on his own territory? Would he consider doing that in the future if there's another mutiny? There was no risk in my assessment of Putin using nuclear weapons. At least politically, I cannot imagine that conversation arising. Well, let's say Wagner have taken 2 cities and are keeping them. Let's say that they're marching with a very big concentration of a lot of numbers in a condensed space. No. So no, that would be absolutely off the charts for Putin to use a tactical nuclear weapon in a situation like this. They wouldn't have. I mean, that'd have been okay to stop. If Prigozhin tried to actually storm the Kremlin, he probably wouldn't have. They would have been happy to incur a lot of collateral damage and destroy these folks from the air. So no, I cannot imagine nuclear weapons being used in this kind of situation. Can Prigozhin's revolt shatter Putin's self-evident multimodal AI art is asking? Can Prigozhin's revolt shatter Putin's self-evident assumption that the revolt inside Russia is impossible? This is a fascinating question because Putin does not believe in indigenous revolt. He always thinks that revolutions aren't ultimately real because they have to be foreign-sponsored events. So that is fascinating, how Putin computes this, because surely he isn't going to say that Mr. Prigozhin is a NATO asset. Mr. Dugin was saying that on Mr. Putin's behalf. But Putin wouldn't say that. I think Putin would be able to snap out of that matrix on a few rare occasions where it's just completely impossible to be in it. This is one of them. I mean, he would still say that this is only happening because the evil West is putting so much pressure on Russia via arming Ukraine. Alexei is asking, should Prigozhin be worried for his life? Yeah. On the basis of the current available knowledge, I don't see why he shouldn't be worried. So, absolutely. I don't think, Nautica, if your question is, was this a co-conspiracy between Putin and Prigozhin, um, I think there is no chance that that's the case. Not a single expert thinks that that's the case. So this isn't some sort of pre-agreed, mutually agreed banishment of Prigozhin to Belarus with a view to Prigozhin using Wagner to try something out of Belarus on Ukraine. No, this is Prigozhin pushing his boat out in a way that absolutely shocked the Kremlin. Michael, how likely is it that Prigozhin never intended to take the Kremlin, but to get specific concessions whereby he went only as far as needed to get them? I think that um, if by taking the Kremlin you mean positively strive for overthrowing the government and acquiring power, how likely is it that Prigozhin never intended? I think it's 100% likely. I think it's basically nearly certain that that's not what he was trying to do. But he created a coup-like revolutionary situation. Um, that's the problem. But was he trying to extract Putin out of the office of presidency and insert himself into it? No, not at all. Um, I don't think anybody interprets it that way, except sort of outsiders who are thinking, "Oh, coup, march on the city. This must be a proper intentional revolution." No, that's not quite what it was. But it was absolutely. You can't do that and then say that it's an accident that you've created a potentially revolutionary situation. So if you're doing that, you'd better be ready that you might end up overthrowing the regime. Tetris, if Russia causes a meltdown, destruction in Zaporizhia, what would be the repercussions? Well, I can't talk about technical repercussions. I I mean, I remember when Chernobyl was news. I was just about old enough to remember things. Um, the only comments I can make are really political, and a significant nuclear event would change the the balance of opinion in Western capitals about how far the West can get involved. I would be comfortable to say that. The way Kachovka can't actually. Caitlin, if Putin doesn't believe in revolutions, that they can happen organically, what do you think? What does he think happened in 1917? Um, he thinks that a foreign agent by foreign powers was egregiously inserted into the country. So um, Lenin's arrival in Russia and the mode of Lenin's arrival in Russia is for Putin an expression, a model expression of malign foreign interference, which is why he is keen to erase Lenin from Russian history and sort of skip Lenin and somehow, by other means, try to connect the Tsarist empire with the Soviet empire. Aleph, thank you so much. So he has a very triggered relationship with Lenin. Lenin was a very unlovely person. When I was at school in the Soviet Union, Lenin was rather elevated. You weren't told to be nice about Stalin in the 80s in Russian schools, but you were told to be nice about Lenin. Extremely nice. I had to say all kinds of things about how much I loved Lenin. Um, and what did I know? I was curious to go and see Lenin in the mausoleum. In the Soviet period, at that point, there were big queues for that kind of entertainment. And after the Soviet Union, after the Soviet collapse, we increasingly got access to an ever clearer picture of how dysfunctional Lenin was, how repulsive he was, what a gangster and a murderer he was, and what pleasure he took in suffering, and what edicts and letters he wrote, like round up 100 kulaks and exterminate them, so that the people will see, so that the people will tremble. Signed. So Lenin's not Stalin, but not somebody we should romanticize. Having said this, Lenin is a good political theorist, to the point that one of the most sophisticated living political philosophers calls himself a Leninist, which is not a left-wing thing to say about yourself, right? Because people think ideology. If you're a Leninist, you've got to be a communist. No, Lenin had special ideas about how politics worked, about the way political ideas and political practice were related. I suppose I would never think of myself as a Leninist, simply because what you can derive from Lenin, it seems to me you can derive from others instead of Lenin. But there are certainly things that are intellectually robust that some people absolutely derive from Lenin. Lenin was a robust political theorist, robust political thinker, and also very unlovely character. Hi Vlad, is this the start to return to the chaos and disunity of the 90s? No. There wasn't an army of bandits marching on Moscow in the 90s. Even if you look at the outrage and disaster of the first Chechen war, I would still say that at that point, Russia had an incomparably superior monopoly over organized violence on its territory than it does today. I mean, you would never see a Russian army marching on Moscow in the 90s. So, no, they're in a much, much worse situation than that. No, widespread violent opposition cannot begin now. The space is not politicized. There was a little politicizing click. That's it. Regional separatism is a very important question. It needs to be taken region by region. But what you need to do is explore what it means to create the right political conditions for each region to, if you like, express its democratic preference about what it wants to do. Contrary to activists online, at the moment, there is no vast political mobilization, not even a subdued one, for a big sort of domino effect of secessions. That is just not on the cards at the moment. It could manifest in the future. So that's what I would say. But you've got to start with these people living on these territories first. You cannot be a, Polish scholar living in Toronto and you be proclaiming about what should happen on a territory you've never visited, a territory you don't understand, territory whose ethnic complexity you don't understand. That's in itself a kind of imperialism in reverse. So there's a risk of being an imperialist when you draw up these maps of Russia because you're disrespecting the people that live there. And you should respect people that live there. And especially if you think that there are people who would want to separate from the center, you need to discover more about them, find out what they're like. That wasn't quite a rant. We're at 1 hour 20, so we're gonna go till 1:30. Brian, NATO countries are nowhere near enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. They're not within even 7 steps of that. Jack Firecracker, should Russian Jews be concerned? I think that increasingly, this is prediction, increasingly, this Russian regime will start picking on enemies inside, often on very weak grounds with very poor fluid classification. But I think that the story of internal enemies is going to be the story of, we often talk about the story of war on Russian soil being the story of 2023. Well, war on internal enemies may be the story of 2024. This is something that unfortunately I'm expecting. It seems Russia has returned to quasi-feudal state. It's quite a bit to that. An unhappy lord rising up to press their demands and standing down when the king agreed. Well, I think the lord rising up lost. And we're going to find out exactly how he has lost and what that looks like in practice. But there is certainly a crisis of loss of monopoly of organized violence on the Russian soil. Absolutely, because not so much because something similar to what we've seen is going to happen next month again. No, it probably won't. But the trend is in the wrong direction. Russia's borderlessness does not bode well for it. Russia's dissolution of the idea that monopoly over organized violence is a sacred thing. That's a very, very toxic thing that sort of eats through the fabric. You don't get to give Mr. Prigozhin ownership over 50,000 convicts in your penal system. That is an extraordinary overriding of institutional process, even by Russia standards. So the toxic effects of that will be in. We will talk more about this. Nordry, always good to hear your analysis, even if you're wrong about Glenn Gould. You're lucky I don't have a pen here because I would need to write your address, because you cannot criticize my analysis of what's wrong with Glenn Gould's playing without paying for that. Let me say, however, that Glenn Gould played in a completely extraordinary way Berg's piano sonata and had the capacity to play on a very, very high level some 20th century music. So it's very important to not be ideological about great musicians, because we have such a tendency to want to hear what we want to hear. You can't do that. You have to call it out. Some of that Goldberg playing is as good as uh, as good as it gets for that repertory. You have to be able to jump out of um, wanting to hear, of hearing what you want to hear, and it is so dangerous. And the world of professional classical music is awash with that challenge. Okay, I'm going to shut up because I'm going off topic. We need the classical music channel to get going so that we can talk about this. William is asking about Russian aircraft shot down and there being no consequences. Well, there are going to be some consequences that Mr. Prigozhin is, going to incur consequences. Is going to be shifted, but what you have just asked about, I think, feeds right into the conversation that we're having about very, very basic fabrics of control slipping. And this also leads to conversation about morale. Chef Pat grew up not far from Glenn Gould's house. No, Girkin could not succeed. Interesting question. Where Prigozhin failed, Girkin has some organic support. My weighing has not been appropriate over the last few months of Girkin's independence versus Prigozhin's independence. What happened was that Prigozhin was. So this is the paradox with this whole Prigozhin story, that a lot of the best experts on Russia were more wrong than the people who knew much less. And the reason for that is that the better experts understood that Prigozhin was in this functional relationship with the Kremlin. And they understood that Prigozhin's ventilations at the Ministry of Defense were still continuous with this sort of divide and rule approach that Putin had practiced relatively safely for years, but outside of the conditions of the intensity of war. So paradoxically, the people who understood Russian politics better were more slow to move, as potentially evidence was mounting that Mr. Prigozhin was, increasingly developing independence, as well as still serving the Kremlin. It was both. And everybody recognized he was developing a bit more independence. But it's interesting that that was missed by quite a few people, and I'm sure my weighing didn't adjust in time. But my recommendation also to you is that there's a difference between what it takes for me to say the war is going to shift to Russian soil, or even more fundamentally that Western democracy is in decline. What it takes for me to say that is a series of 700 filters. That's not the number of filters that I used for me to weigh comparatively the organicity of figures in Russia's Z world. And it's not my job to track them professionally. I'm a political philosopher. So I would, to some extent, demote, I try to do that on your behalf, but you should also try to do it. That we demote my opinions if I express them, um, if they are about these sorts of intergroup um, intricacies. So it's fascinating that there has been a bit of a problem with reacting in time to this change of balance on seeing Prigozhin as serving the Kremlin versus seeing him as being a rebel. But back to your question about could Girkin succeed? No, Girkin is too much of a sort of politically, he's a sort of a fuzzy idealist. And his place is in the cafeteria. If you abstract his war crimes, then he is the man in the cafeteria talking about things as though he is in the 1700s. So that was a very important shift in Prigozhin's narrative. He said just before the mutiny that, in fact, Shoigu isn't just a dreadful minister of defense, but that he is responsible for starting the war that is so disastrous and so ill-founded, and that Putin is somehow secondary here. That was probably the first thing he said that really was problematic vis-a-vis Putin. So I think you bring about a good point, but I'm not sure I agree with you that nobody's talking about it. I think everybody was. I think every single expert I'm aware of noted that difference. Once Prigozhin came out and said that Putin is so pathetic, he's not really the one who properly put the foundations behind this war together, which is of course absurd because the war is. The war has ideological sympathizers at the top of the Putin regime, but he is its ideological founder, nevertheless. Sleeping Beauties inviting me to self-care after 1.5 hours. Thank you so much. Very, very kind sentiments from you. Barnabas Wannabe, good to see you and thank you. No more decaf for me, actually. Just electrolytes and bed. Okay, last question is going to be from Michael. I don't know what it is, but we're going to find it. Echoing an installer's question, how do you anticipate this event shifts the ratios of politicized, depoliticized citizens in Russia that you often mention? It doesn't. What it does do is, Rachel, I can see that comment. I'm not sure who's roasting your beans or where they're coming from if you think decaf tastes horrible. It does taste horrible 98% of the time, but it doesn't have to. Michael, the point isn't that that balance is shifted, that we say whatever we say, 60 in the middle, 20 on either side, or 50, 25, 25, or 60, 10, 10, and the others are a mystery. No, that's not the point that I'm saying. I'm not saying that the depoliticized blob has shrunk. I am saying with the right political action, they are a drop more movable now. That's really what I'm saying. So I'm saying that this requires leadership. This requires, I'm not going to say requires a Lenin, but this requires leadership. This requires storytelling. This requires continually encouraging people to see that there is this alternative, right? So what I'm saying is that the reluctance to not see, the reluctance to see the alternative to Putin is so extreme in Russia because of the level of depoliticization, and reasons for that we've talked through quite a bit. But that reluctance is so extreme. What I'm saying is that reluctance has diminished a bit. I'm not saying people have woken up. I'm saying that reluctance is a little bit more now toward a shape you still can't work with it, but it's a little bit more toward that shape now. You can begin doing this with it if you are intelligent in how you message, how you activate, how you engage people, if you are, let's say, the Russian opposition. So that's what I would say about that. There's a little bit more pliancy now, and more of a capacity for, these different elements categorized according to levels of politicization and depoliticization in Russia. There's more possibility for these elements to shift a little bit. Have a great night, Roz, and a wonderful week too. Somebody's mentioning Karamurza appropriately. No more super thanks, please, Michael. I'll take your question quickly, and then we're going to send everybody off with love and gratitude. How can Putin make decisive moves that increase totalitarianism if Prigozhin has his loyalists in positions that would take these decisions? I'm not sure how many loyalists Prigozhin has. He doesn't have really loyalists. He had maybe some people who were more open than others to putting certain things into question. But then it's precisely these Z folks and the various types of them who would be forcing Putin into what he would regard as premature totalitarian excesses, premature actions to militarize the society, militarize the economy. Putin wants to go there, but he is convinced it's wrong now. But my sense is that he could be pushed into doing things in 2024 that he thinks he shouldn't try until 2027. Why is that? Well, it's because his dream is indeed to move towards some kind of large-scale conflict with the West and mobilize the society politically for that. But he knows that's nowhere near where he is at now, but I think he's going to be pushed a bit in that direction. And I do think, therefore, an acceleration of totalitarian turns and various kinds of militarization of the society are going to come faster than Putin would even like them to come, perhaps. So that's me running out of any capacity to make common sense. So lots of love, gratitude, and check out the main channel video if you haven't. Don't do it today if it's late where you are. Please take really good care. We're going to be connected very soon. Bye everybody. Big hug to everyone. Bye.